And there you go.
And here we are.
Again. What are we talking about this week? The same as we talked about. No, not the same as we talked about last week. No, definitely not last week. Because last week we got our video taken down for saying naughty things.
2 weeks ago. Last week we played it safe.
Oh, you were on Facebook last week.
America's a big bad empire, Kazakhstan, geopolitics. YouTube has no problem with that. But the week before was medical misinformation.
Yeah.
Even though the things we said, as we'll see now, are now breaking news.
Yes.
This week, we're going to try as close as possible just to cite what official reports are saying.
Yeah.
On the COVID.
Well, and we won't extrapolate at all.
You have to, right?
You have to extrapolate. But it's in the extrapolation that you get in trouble.
They say, no. You cannot.
That opinion you shared is censored. Because the thing about it is it is dangerous. Because if anybody listening to this who listens to or watches our show were to, listen to what we said and being the mindless slaves and drones that they are, would automatically take what we said to be 100% true and then go and act on it, they could kill themselves by, like, for example, not getting a vaccine. Because everybody knows that if you don't get a vaccine, you will die. Is that medical misinformation?
Yeah, I think so.
Basically, is that medical misinformation?
You could be causing harm.
What I just say is what I just said medical misinformation.
No, that's what they will say is the reason for.
But I just said that if you don't get a vaccine, you will die. Is that medical misinformation?
Not in the context in which you said it, which is that we should be banned, which is okay.
No, but if you take it as a statement in and of itself.
If you cut it out from what you said and edit it and just have.
Will I get banned? Do you think you get banned from YouTube for saying if you don't get a vaccine, you will die?
You'll get your video either demonetized. We don't have that, or it'll be a strike.
Do you think so? Removed. If I'm advocating for vaccines, I'll get a strike.
Huh?
I just said if you don't get a vaccine, you will die.
Ah, right. Okay. I'm confused.
Yeah.
I heard what I wanted to hear.
Exactly. That's the problem. So that's what I want to know. I just said.
There's been a lot of really clever tweets from people and other memes going around where it looks like the way they're phrasing it, they're on one side of the debate.
Yeah.
But in fact, everyone skips and they go, "Oh, screw you. I thought you were on our side," But if you read it closer, there's a negative junction in there or a clause or a comma. That totally changes the whole meaning.
So it's an interesting exercise. No, if I say that, I think I'll have said it for the fourth time now. If you don't get a vaccine, you will die. Should I not? Is that not medical misinformation? And should we not get?
It is medical misinformation, but it's politically correct information.
Oh, okay. So it's not about facts or accuracy or science.
Your messaging is in line with the authorities. YouTube would literally say something like that. Therefore, it's fine.
Okay.
That is what if you look at the message they send us.
Yeah, our guidelines, right?
Our guidelines are that if you're saying something that's broadly not in line with what medical authorities are saying, we have a problem with it.
That's a problem, yeah. So it's not really
it's almost apologetic. Sorry, we just had to take this video down.
So it's not really about facts. It's about, well, facts are assumed to be what the experts say, and there's a specific group of experts. They're held up. There's no... it's an interesting thing. There's no really credential basis to the experts that are the authorities, right, that are listened to. It's almost like they're the authority, the experts who are in authority, who have power. What they say is true. So power equals truth.
Yes.
Because there's lots of other scientists, very well-credentialed scientists, who don't agree with what the authority scientists say. But it's the authority scientists who are the ones who, i.e. the ones who are in position to power, who are government scientists, who the government listens to, I suppose, because very often you hear government saying that they're listening to the science, but obviously they're not listening to all the science, right? Because there's a lot of dissenting science there. So it's only a specific group of scientists or a specific area of the science, let's say, that the government listens to and propagates and runs with, and that becomes the truth. So it's not
even clear what, quote, the government is. If you read, for example, Scott Atlas's summary of what it was like working for about 8 months. Formerly, he was hired by the president, i.e. the government, the White House executive of the United States government, by Donald Trump,
right,
to be on their version of SAGE over in the US. He spends 8 months before he's booted or leaves with Trump or leaves just before or something. We now know, because he wrote a very detailed book about what happened, going every day with data to say, I think we should do this or not do that. Okay.
Yeah.
And here's a bunch of the latest from medical websites, peer-reviewed papers, whatever, the best studies. It wasn't even that it was him competing with an opposing argument that had equivalent numbers of papers to cite. He turned up, and Fauci,
And the rest of
Birx,
them.
and a few others just had nothing and just went, that's not what the science says.
Yeah.
And they all nodded in unison. But they had no science with them.
Right.
That was the most amazing thing about it. Now, Scott Lattis wasn't strictly alone. There were others as well on his side, in quotes, but he's the only one who's spoken out about what it was like every day inside, quote, the government.
So he's an example of someone who was an authority, was a medical authority, i.e. attached to the government, but who was dismissed by the media as not the science.
Yeah.
Because the science was a different individual or group of individuals within the Trump administration who were kind of like sidelined by Trump. But they were the ones who the media and others promoted as the real science. And of course, anybody that Trump supported in terms of science was not the science, that was the fake science, because Trump himself was illegitimate, because he wasn't a legitimate authority in the eyes of most of the media. Therefore, they could dismiss that authority. So it's not just that they can dismiss certain science as not authoritative and accept another group of scientists as authoritative. They can also do that with governments. They can sideline an entire government as not the authority.
Yeah.
So it's very variable. It's not, and it seems to be down to the media or someone behind the media or some other group, like we've talked about the deep state and the Washington establishment. That seems to be the real authority behind the scenes, and they're the ones who decide from behind the scenes what the authority in any particular area actually is. And then most of the media repeats that. Partly,
But that suggests an enormous amount of ongoing efforts on their behalf to keep it so. But there's also a huge amount of that's structural in nature. You've got whole segments of the population that don't even need to be primed by said deep state media organs or what have you.
You mean ordinary
they
people?
will instinctively go, that's the truth.
Yeah.
And that's the fake news.
And you're talking about ordinary people here, right?
Yeah.
But that's because we've talked about this before.
Now, if required, you could argue that required previous primings in other incidents to lead them to that point. But
it requires priming in the sense of the past 2 years and the priming that they've been subjected to over the past 2 years in terms of being told that they lived in a deadly pandemic and all the sacrifices they made to do their part as part of keeping everybody safe and putting an end to this deadly pandemic. That there's that whole kind of sunk cost fallacy type thing, or that's one aspect of it. But it's another aspect is it's simply lived experience, that when people experience something as real, like having to go through all the things that people went through, basically, social distancing, not seeing their families, isolation, all that kind of stuff, business.
having to take the vaccines when they actually didn't want to.
Right. All of that is a direct lived experience for people, and it argues in their minds and in their emotions for the official narrative about the pandemic being true. Therefore, they will back up any official source that says that validates the idea that it was all as they said it was, as they experienced it, and as the official story claimed it was. So that's the problem with a lot of ordinary people, the ones who really just went with it unthinkingly, lived it, experienced it, became part of their being, and now they continue to argue for it. That's part of their reality. Whereas there was, a significant number of other people who were quite skeptical from the very beginning and chose a different path, didn't live that same experience. Of course, they were isolated and restricted and all that kind of stuff, but they were dissenting all the way through that. And in their minds, they didn't integrate it into their personal experience, let's say, as being real. And therefore, those people are the ones who take the opposite approach today.
Yeah. They followed, so to speak. But internally, they were like, this is weird. This is strange. I'm holding this at bay.
Right.
So to speak, psychically, while I act like everyone else.
Go through the motions, Yeah, it's interesting. No, but I'd like to, it would be, I don't know, it would be interesting. I mean, medical misinformation, I'm pretty sure that it should objectively come under medical misinformation.
To claim that taking a vaccine will save you.
No, to claim that if you don't take the vaccine, you will die. It's kind of different.
Okay.
There's some wiggle room where you could see that saying that taking a vaccine will potentially save your life. You could maybe argue that. But to say that if you don't take one, you will die, I think it's definitely medical misinformation. So I'm expecting a strike from YouTube on that one. I've said it 5 times now in about 10 minutes.
The thing is, you're in line with actual government statements.
But it's false.
From France, Germany, the UK, and the United States in the last 4 weeks.
But it's demonstrably false, no? There's something like, I don't know how many, untold tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world who haven't taken the vaccine who aren't dead.
According to the German government, they'll be dead in a few weeks. They won't survive the winter.
But that'll definitely overwhelm the overwhelm the health service. Like that'll be the end of the health service if like hundreds of millions of people all die in a couple of weeks. Like,
or bypass them. In theory, if they get their wish, the German government will just have to spend a lot of time hiring diggers to, dig mass graves and not bother hurting the healthcare system or protect the healthcare system, sacrifice millions of Germans. If this sounds extreme, bear in mind, I'm citing the German government in December saying by the end of this winter, you will either be one of 3 things, no other possibilities: vaccinated, dead, or what was the third one? I think they left it at 2.
or recovered.
Or recovered.
You'll have got it and recovered, which might be everybody.
Right.
Well, actually, according to the Omicron statistics and the data about Omicron, that's the real one. Everybody will have had Omicron and still be alive. Maybe after having had a few sniffles and a headache or something, but that's about it.
Well, that's the topic we're leading with this week, isn't it? Like it's kind of COVID truth at last, so to speak, coming through in all directions.
Yeah.
Not least from the US CDC. Do you want to have this BBC article up first?
Yeah, throw that up for a start.
After 2 years of pointing out the distinction between dying from COVID or with it, it's now headline news on the BBC 18, 19, 20 months later.
Yeah. So COVID deaths are rising sharply in the UK, but an increasing proportion of these are actually due to something else. Really? Something else. That's because, what could that be? That's because some people die with COVID rather than from it. No way. That's, my mind's just blown. That's just, I've never heard that before. Oh, hang on, I did. Oh yeah, it was me, repeatedly, almost every day over the past 18 months. The Omicron wave is driving rising infections, which means more people will catch it and some will get sick. Deaths will inevitably increase too, but not all will be true COVID cases, true COVID ones. Others will be people who happened to test positive. It's a bit galling. Like, I mean, I think I and most others are pretty well insulated in a certain sense against the kind of normal, natural, predictable outrage that might come from having to witness this when, after 2 years of shouting about it and seeing it as a way to prevent the kind of march towards kind of dystopian, kind of authoritarian dictatorship, almost like policies by government in different societies and a lot of societies around the world. Us pushing that angle, like, listen, you're overstating the numbers. People who are dying, all the numbers you're giving for people dying from COVID, a lot of them are with COVID. They didn't die from COVID, and you don't need to use these. You can't reasonably use this allegation that all these people are dying from COVID to justify lockdowns and vaccine passes and segregation in society. You can't do that. We've been trying to do that for 18 months to no avail. Mm-hmm. Stonewalled, blanked, shut up, conspiracy theorists, tinfoil hatter. And now it's on the BBC, not just the BBC, but it's also on throw up the JPEG there, Scott E. It's also, I mean, this is just one more example. It's kind of interesting, this one actually. This is in the Herald, the Scottish Herald. Case rates lowest in unvaccinated as double jabbed elderly drive rise in hospital admission. So this is slightly different, although obviously connected. Double jabbed Scots are now more likely to be admitted to hospital with COVID than the unvaccinated, amid an increase in elderly people falling ill due to waning immunity. It comes amid weird data showing the case rates have been lower in unvaccinated individuals than the single, double, or even triple jabbed since Omicron became the dominant variant in Scotland. So to this reporter, to these people at this newspaper in Scotland, it's weird, which suggests that they can't really figure it out. There's something very strange about this, where, and this is on a case rate basis, so it's you can't even use the excuse that, well, of course there's going to be more people more vaccinated in hospital than unvaccinated because of the because there's more people vaccinated, right? It's on a ratio basis.
But until 10 days ago, the message was most hospitalizations, cases, whatever,
Right.
are among the unvaccinated.
Right. And there's a graph. I don't think
I have the graph. Scott, I just sent it.
Do you
to
have
him.
it? Send them.
This is
throw
the
graph
weird
up.
data.
So this is the weird data, yeah. So if you look out there, it's vaccination status in Scotland, 28% unvaccinated, 72% vaccinated. So, but in the breakdown of cases, you have 85%, so 72% are vaccinated, but 85% of the cases are among the vaccinated. 78% of hospitalizations are among the vaccinated. And almost 80%, 79.5% of deaths are among the vaccinated. Now, those look quite high and stuff, but they're obviously all quite low, especially deaths and hospitalizations. There's very few people actually going to hospital or dying from any specific virus right now.
Vaxxed or not otherwise.
So that graph makes it clear that this is the weird aspect of it. So it's not just about, like I said, where you can't claim that, well, of course that's going to be the case because most people are vaccinated. It's actually the vaccinated are outstripping the unvaccinated in terms of getting sick and ill and dying as a result of Omicron or whatever. So
assuming their standards are consistent, what it shows is actually potentially vaccine negative efficacy. Because if 28% are vaccinated, are not vaccinated in Scotland, yet the deaths are lower than that rate, you're more likely.
Yeah.
It suggests you're more likely to die.
Go ahead, get banned. get this video banned. Go ahead. But based on the data from a newspaper and it's actually from publichealthscotland.com published this graph, published this data, and what it says pretty unequivocally is that if you're vaccinated, your risk of being in hospital and dying are greater than if you're unvaccinated. Which suggests, following on the logic from that, is that the vaccines don't work. Now, of course, plenty of people have said that vaccines are waning, at least waning in efficacy. They don't really work very well, not least the CEO of Pfizer said it a couple of weeks ago. We don't have the video, but you can find it easily yourself. He himself said that double vaccinated, you pretty much don't have any protection whatsoever. So here we're at the point where we can't say stuff like this, even though the authorities, the sanctioned authorities are saying it, but we can't say it.
Or it could be inferred from what they're saying.
Well, it's pretty clear, and even using objective data, right? But we're not allowed to say certain things. There's that data from Scotland, for example, you can't look at it any other way, or you can't conclude anything other than if you're vaccinated, your risk of being in hospital or dying from COVID of whatever strain is higher than if you're unvaccinated. But by saying that, based on that objective data, YouTube might ban this video. What is that? Do you want to infer anything from that? What that means, where we are, or what kind of world we live in, or how bad the situation is? No, well, it's pretty obvious, right? But that's just the way it is. I mean, it says that conclusion, whatever conclusion you would draw from that we live in some kind of a, totalitarian type, society where speech, accurate, truthful speech is censored by big tech. That's as unimpeachable a conclusion you can reach that conclusion as fairly and objectively as the conclusion you reach from reading that data about vaccinated and unvaccinated. I mean, both of them follow on very logically, very objectively, very empirically. Mm-hmm. So do you think you get banned from YouTube for saying that YouTube censors truthful speech?
No comment. I'll leave that thought hanging in the air.
I don't know. I'm just
Well,
connecting some dots here. I'm open to being.
Here's a pattern. Last summer, people were getting banned from YouTube and other social media sites for mentioning it. You just had to be talking about it. It was in the news, but you weren't allowed to talk about it.
Yeah.
The Wuhan lab Fauci gain of function
Yeah.
thing. Just
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about it. You couldn't
Yeah.
talk about it. Just shut up. Don't talk about it.
Yeah.
But it's been talked about several times in the media since then because of high-profile leaks. Now, that's no longer a bannable offense.
Right. You can say that it may have come from a lab.
That's not the only instance of this. In general, what's happening is the mainstream and the social media owners are following behind of what can be said. And gradually they are sort of lifting their controls on this.
Yeah.
There's if everyone's used to, waves and curves and flattening the curves. Well, there was the curve of people rushing to the forefront to say, hang on, if you look at this data differently, you can infer this from it.
Right.
Banned.
Not allowed to infer that.
But we have finally got to the point
Stop
where
inferring.
the BBC is making the distinction that was a bannable offence perhaps 18 months ago, to make the distinction between
Right.
what it means to actually die from COVID
Yeah.
versus
Yeah.
the incredible numbers they were showing, tens of thousands every week in some countries. So
Should that BBC article and many others like it that are saying the same thing? It's come from Fauci, it's come from the CDC director, making that distinction. And
do you have that tweet from her this week?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, do you?
She says it all.
But should that not be? Should that not come with an admission of error for what they were saying? Should they not say that we were wrong now that this seems to be the case? Well, maybe they won't say that. Maybe they'll say that's only the case now with Omicron, but they don't really seem to be saying that. They seem to be saying that they don't say that this is something that was going on all along, but they don't say it wasn't. And it's certainly an open question as to whether, if this is now what's happening, surely that's that process by which COVID, with and from deaths, the mixing of those two is something that is, if it's being seen now, surely that's based on a system that was set up long ago, like in terms of the past 2 years. Surely that's the way it's been all along. Surely that's a reasonable question to ask. Is this the way it's always been? Are you looking at seeing this problem now with the distinction between with and from, and the fact that a lot of people are in hospital who are put down as having died from COVID actually only died with it. They were in the hospital for something else completely, and with that other thing that killed them. The fact that you're noticing this now because it's happening and it's coming out of hospitals, is it reasonable to suggest that was the way it has been all along? That's part of the way the counting was done all along? Or is it just, have you suddenly changed your counting?
Yeah. I think it's reasonable to suggest that an editor or 2 or 10 or 15, all of them at the BBC in this example, knew otherwise, knew better, but were following either actual written instruction,
Right.
or their perception of what would be approved by higher-ups in presenting what could and could not be reported, and the framework for acceptable debate within that range, as the range changed over the 2 years.
Yeah.
So the BBC doing this now is not it's not a learning on the part of the writer or editor who published that. It's an acknowledgement that they knew that to be the case, or at least were aware that the other side that's been banned all this time had a point.
So why would they have gone along with it then?
Because they were, quote, trusting the science. Where trusting the science means following the party line. But the science can be said.
The science knew it at the time as well. Then,
yes.
Let's say the science knew it, but what would the justification have been from government to tell the media to don't talk about this? Keep saying what we're telling you to say. Part of the justification would be that we talked about this previously with the behavioral scientists, where they said that positive. Was it positive news? Don't allow for decisions.
It was important to have the messaging. I'm more or less paraphrasing them now. even if the messaging is going too far and it's not actually a mapping with the scientific reality of this pandemic as it is now, we must go, but we must make sure that they are afraid of this thing.
We have to exaggerate effectively.
Exaggerate it for their own good. I'm paraphrasing.
But how does that square if it's for their own good? Because you're telling people that they're dying
because their plausible meta-narrative behind the narratives they were publishing was that we don't know how bad this thing can get.
But surely the data was showing them that it wasn't bad, and this is a year into it.
Well,
the data was showing that most of the people in hospitals were dying with COVID rather than from COVID. And here I'm assuming that this was the way it was going on all along. And if you're looking at that, you're seeing that actually, no, this virus isn't as deadly as is being made out. But let's pretend it is in order to protect people from what?
I don't know, because you've hit the crux of the matter. In January of 2020, you and I were looking at the data from China and doing some rough calculations. And even as they began to come in from Italy and Iran, the first places hit after Wuhan, Hubei province, China, we said, okay, the hysteria has definitely ramped up. There's military on the streets in Italy. We can see that. We understand why everyone's shitting their pants. But the data is still looking like...
Well, Italy's official data very soon after, within a couple of months, was 95% of the deaths in March and April, or April and May last year, 95% were over 80 with multiple comorbidities, i.e. that's with COVID, that's not from COVID.
Yeah.
And there were several other countries who produced the same data, but that was just ignored. So, I mean, you can see our reason for skepticism with that data right from the beginning, and how it's been validated all the way along, and now it's being validated almost 2 years later by the BBC and other major, not just the media, but let's go to the fourth Twitter one along our CDC director. This is the CDC director, obviously, Rochelle.
There's actually, before we do that, Aeneas just posted a comment and said, in Denmark, health authorities also have said a few weeks ago that there is a need to distinguish between dying with and dying of COVID.
Yeah.
What took them so long?
Well, it's not just... It's not,
so it's not even just media, it's actually governments.
Yeah, governments, of course, and that's what I was going to say. Well, government. She's not government, she's the CDC director, but she's almost above government in a certain sense, I suppose, in terms of dictating the course of the type of messaging around this. Just throw it up there. It's a tweet she made. What date is on it? 12th of January, 4 days ago. She's citing a study, so it's an authoritative study, obviously, because she's citing it. A study on severity of those infected with Omicron compared to Delta. 53% less risk of symptomatic hospitalization, 74% less risk of ICU admission, and 91% less risk of death. And 0 Omicron patients required mechanical ventilation. So,
and the point to be inferred from that is the director of the CDC is making it very clear that Omicron, the current wave, 4th or 5th, I forget, is less dangerous, markedly less dangerous than at least the previous one, if not all three.
Well, it's down to the level of...
So that's clear. That's what she's trying to say there.
It's down to the level of a cold, of the seasonal flu or seasonal cold.
Yeah.
Or less, maybe. So, yeah. Are we allowed to say that? I don't know. There's another one, the one before that, Scotty. This is the European Medicines Agency. This is from, it's interesting. Actually, if you look at the tweet, if you look just down below, misleading. The European Medicines Agency is an agency of the European Union that's in charge of the evaluation and supervision of medicinal products. So they're basically the overseers of what medicines or, validation or ratification, let's say, of medicines for their rollout to the public. And they produced a little video January 11th, there you see. But it's interesting, just before you listen to it, misleading. Twitter put up a little misleading thing on this. I don't know why. It's from the European Union's top medical authority, effectively.
Yeah.
Learn why health officials consider COVID-19 vaccine safe for most people. And yet, let's just listen to what they say. Boom.
There are two concerns here, is that if we have a strategy in which we give boosters, let's say, every 4 months approximately, we will end up potentially having problem with the immune response, and the immune response may end up not being as good as we would like it to be. So we should be careful in not overloading the immune system with repeated immunization. And secondly, of course, there is the risk of fatiguing the population with the continuous administration of boosters.
So he basically is warning in a very diplomatic way that repeated administration of boosters to the population would cause effectively immunodeficiency. And immunodeficiency is pretty serious. There's people who are living with immunodeficiency for other reasons, and it's not good. It's very debilitating. So he's, pointing out that repeated administration of boosters would compromise and damage people's immune systems. And despite that, when I say boosters, I mean vaccines. So repeated administration of vaccines for COVID would damage people's immune system. But Twitter decided to put a little notice underneath that statement by the European Medicines Agency that this is misleading, and you should learn why health officials consider COVID-19 vaccines safe for most people. Pick it out of that. I don't know. Figure it out yourself. What's going on? But
there's likely some geopolitics. It was the European Parliament that blew the lid on the swine flu vaccine in 2009.
Yeah.
Which effectively rendered it not going to happen in Europe at the time.
Yeah.
And within a couple of months, the US backed off doing it in North America. They probably, they don't mind labeling a top European agency because they don't. In a sense, it's ironic because a bit like not most European people themselves, they doubt the authority of the European Union.
America is the fount of all wisdom. You look to America and Fauci for the
and if you look at the national governments, especially the leading ones, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, the Western European governments especially, they're fully in lockstep with the messaging. Like our commentator just said about Denmark, the same thing goes out everywhere at the same time, roughly. Whether that's instruction, as I suggested earlier, or just something instinctive in the air that they all read,
Yeah, and it's not just let's look at the Irish Times there. The headline is good enough, I suppose. It's almost farcical. I mean, we're trying to contain our laughter here. Just throw it up there, Scotty. We're trying to contain our laughter because it is farcical. Most hospital patients with COVID-19 have no viral symptoms.
And do they have any symptoms?
Well, just to underline the point, just go to the first paragraph there. Most patients in hospital with COVID-19 have no symptoms of the disease.
Most patients in hospital with this disease have no symptoms of this disease. That's another way of saying that.
I just want a lot more stunned silence in response to these. I'm struggling to keep my jaw where it should be. I'm just I have no words. I don't know what to say. I don't know how much more obvious it can be. How much.
Yeah.
Anyway, meanwhile, third Twitter link there, Israel's largest hospital. This was today, actually. I think, anyway. Yeah, today. Israel's largest hospital attacks Israeli health ministry for ridiculous COVID policy. That was me. This is Israel's largest hospital, and this woman her name is Edith Matot. Anyway, she posted it on Hebrew, and I translated it. So she starts there, good week. Well, this is translation. Good week. Hi. These days, we are marking 2 years since the outbreak of the corona plague, and unfortunately, if there is one thing that's still drives the decision makers in this event. It is the anxiety and the feeling of fear. Flexibility means being agile in our ability to be flexible, to understand at any given time that we're facing and to act accordingly. Blah, blah. Omicron belongs to the corona family, but there is nothing to compare it with previous strains that have caused a prolonged and severe illness. It is not the American. I don't know what she means by that. In fact, for a month now, we have been seeing and understanding that the Omicron is highly contagious but has minimal damage potential. Minimal. And evidently, we have no respirators in Ichilov, which is the hospital, biggest hospital in Israel, with Omicron. Not even one. So not even one respirator. And that mirrors the CDC. Walensky, that no one, zero patients needed to be
in the United States,
intubated in the US.
This is fast.
What they have are patients with respiratory flu, she said. These patients are not counted and published except for the annual article on the old woman from the corridor. Influenza is a disease without public relations, but she kills. The numbers that are shown to us by corona patients are light for the most part and difficult. They have corona, but for the most part they are not because of corona. They have corona, but for the most part they are not because of corona. What does that mean? They have the flu, they have the cold? Well, actually, no, she means maternity. So, I don't know what she means by maternity. Maybe women in maternity wards. But she says, young after falling from a scooter, treated with infection and more. So she's pointing here to other reasons that they're in hospital, right? Which is the kind of main point here in all of this and all this reporting, that people who are in hospital and supposedly with COVID are not there with COVID at all. In Ireland, they have no symptoms, and in most other places, they're mild symptoms, and in fact, they're in hospital for something entirely different, and have simply been tested, and may or may not even have any symptoms. So she says, therefore, the publicity of the number of severe patients with corona that appears every day in the media is misleading. In fact, critically ill patients because of the corona are isolated, and also for some, the aggravated definition of a serious patient, as we have spoken in the past, creates a false representation of illegitimate serious illness, and in practice only creates anxiety and leads to problematical managerial decisions. Instead of treating this strain accordingly, people are forced to be imprisoned in their homes, and we are de facto in a kind of closure, and the state is on the verge of collapse. Are we crazy? And for what? It reminds me that a few weeks ago a few drops came down here, but we gave it a name, Carmel, and we all waited for the flood. That she means it rained. Now it's really just a matter of branding. So anyway, and she goes on about certainly for children who need a routine life, we rob them of their childhood, of their development, of learning. We give them fear, mental disorders, regression. Please save our future generation, but also save the parents who are isolated with the children. Hundreds of thousands of isolated on for what? A huge population walks around asymptomatically with Omicron, and we do not even know. Many people have become infected and are unaware of it. She says the guidelines need to be adapted. So anyway, that's from Israel. There apparently is some sanity left even in Israel.
Yeah.
So, but then, okay, so
Pockets
what are we looking at here? Omicron is the Omicold, nothing burger. It's over. It's done. If it ever was anything, it's over and it's done now. But vaccines are still in place. Are they going to? Is there much talk about a fourth booster? There's talk about a fourth booster here and there, but I think it's kind of going away. A lot of people have had 3 shots. Is that where they're going to end it? Is it because of all these footballers and athletes and different people collapsing with chest pains and the evidence that vaccines have side effects, disproportionately large number of side effects, like we said, heart inflammation? Is that finally coming to bear and putting the kibosh on the whole get more and more vaccines? If you just go to there's 2 studies. There's a bit of a debate on Twitter. Actually, it was on Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan, you remember that we were talking about earlier on the Joe Rogan had some dude, he's a journalist, on recently, and there was a little section that was spread around on Twitter where
The journalist supposedly fact-checked
Joe
Rogan.
Rogan, who's saying that you have a higher risk of getting heart, especially young males have a higher risk of getting myocarditis or pericarditis or both as a result of the vaccination compared to
From getting COVID.
From getting COVID. And so Rogan had said this, was making this point, and the guy pushed back and told him that no, it's the opposite. It's significantly more, you have a significantly higher risk of getting heart inflammation from COVID than you have from the vaccine. And Rogan backed down, and he did a mea culpa
And he
on
cited,
Twitter.
cited the study.
And cited the study that the guy cited, but that's only one study. And in fact, you have to wonder where it came from. But at the same time, within the past week or 2 weeks, you just go to the Israel National News. In this article, they're citing a study. New research suggests heart inflammation may be more common than initially believed and becomes more likely among young with booster shots. If you just scroll down to young, keep going. Keep going down. Among all patients, where's that? No, not among all patients. Keep going. Importantly, it begins with, importantly, towards the bottom there, right there. Importantly, the study found that not only were males under 40 at far higher risk for myocarditis from any of the vaccines than from COVID infection, multiple doses of all the vaccines appear to cause a cumulative effect in increasing risk for the heart inflammation condition. Yes, now that jives with, or dovetails with, what the European Medicines Agency were just saying, warning about repeated booster doses, that he just said that it would...
Although about a different issue, but
well,
it's related.
He said compromise the immune system, of course, yeah. So there's that, and the next one is another from recently, within the last couple of weeks, a large British study. It's the next, it's the Liberty Loft. Another study, separate from the one you just saw in the Israel National News, large British study finds risk of myocarditis doubles after each mRNA jab.
God.
First paragraph. A study coming out of Britain showed an alarming increase in the risk of myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart, after every mRNA jab, particularly in males under 40. The study was published last month, so it's from December. Analysed over 42 million people, 13 and older, who had taken a COVID-19 shot. It was conducted by various researchers from institutions at the University of Oxford, Leicester, Edinburgh, King's College London, and the University of Nottingham. The findings showed that myocarditis risk doubled after one jab, doubled again after a second jab, and doubled yet again after a third booster jab.
Wow. And the horrifying thing for Israel is that its young population is the most boosted on the earth.
Yeah.
I think of all the countries, when it comes to the fourth shot, Israel is most people from 12 up.
Further on down in that article, it says the American Heart Association has released similar studies finding that the overwhelming majority of younger Americans developing myocarditis were injected with an experimental mRNA jab within a month of developing the condition.
Right, and note that the overwhelming majority of younger Americans developing myocarditis, that includes any of them that you could ascribe to developing it from COVID. So on the total number of younger Americans developing myocarditis, the overwhelming majority were injected with an experimental mRNA jab. Not that the overwhelming majority did not have COVID. The overwhelming majority were injected with an experimental mRNA jab.
I mean, does Twitter pull up Israeli National News and the Lancet now for medical misinformation?
They should, if they post it on
The horrifying thing about the Israeli situation is that many of the best numbers, they've been frank about publishing numbers. That's why Alex Berenson and others will often go to Israel. And it's not just because he's a New York Jew, you know, going to Israel for the best data. It's because they're one of the few places that have been consistently frank in publishing, and allowing their own national news organizations to say, well, here's the other side of the argument.
They also rolled it out.
That's the horrible thing.
People.
They've got the most truthiness going on in that country, and they're the most boosted.
I think the two go together. In advance, they've had longer. They did it first. They rolled it out first. They did the mRNA vaccines first and to most people, and they also boosted people the first compared to any other country in the world. So they have advanced down the line in terms of seeing what possible side effects, and that's maybe why you're getting the data out of Israel, because they've had longer than most other countries to see the actual side effects.
It's some kind of sick game going on there. Did you see the video this week of the Israeli Prime Minister doing a press PR stand? He's in the room with the press in a hospital, and someone's child has been brought in against his or her will,
Right.
to be jabbed. I think it's a 9-year-old girl. And she's screaming, like, no, I don't want it. And she's got two relatives holding her, surrounded by nurses. And he's there prancing around, you know, blah, 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 about how great this is going to be.
Yep.
And now we're going to watch stab. And she's just like screaming, like, get me the fuck out of here.
It's pretty sick.
This is like, when you're at that level of, here's the truth about how this is mucking up their health. And we're doing it to you anyway. And we've no shame. Like you say, you drop your jaw in silence, or if you're in the middle of a situation, you lash out. I mean, you're always going to feel sympathy for people who are, because what else are they supposed to do? It's pathocratic. It's like full on. We're telling you one thing. This is what it's going to do to you, and you must do it. Like.
Yeah, well,
and everyone else has done it. In Israel, you have the social proof of really 90% of people around you have done it.
And behind it all is, as I've said many times on the show, is that behind it all, or supporting it all, and really the core of the problem is a large majority of people in the world being unwilling or unable, or both, to accept that governments would engage in this kind of a socially this kind of socially destructive policy, not just in terms of destroying society, but potentially destroying people's health, that they would actually do that, and people just can't go there, and that's the problem. You know, because if people knew what was going on, or had, you know, if people were to take in all of the facts that we're presenting to them and make a judgment, you know, based on the evidence that's available to them, and there's quite a lot of evidence, I think most people would side with would come down on the skeptical side of things, you know, and they would start to question the whole thing. And if they go further in that direction, it could become quite outraged, you know. But and that would put an end to it. But that doesn't happen because people are unwilling to believe and accept, or unwilling or unable to accept that there can be such a level of mendacity and recklessness and carelessness in government towards the population. They just won't accept that. So until they, I don't know what needs to happen for them to accept that as actually part of the reality, you know. But so yeah, all of the evidence as we just laid out is pointing, even from specifically from authoritative sources, is pointing that this is kind of done. It's over. It's Omicron, it's the sniffles. The CDC director has said as much, and yet governments, at least in some places, continue to push for vaccines, and more egregiously implementing policies or passing laws that criminalize almost people for not getting a vaccine. At this point, can you imagine, for the cold? Criminalizing people. We'll just throw up a few articles here. I mean, just to remind people, the first RT one, it's presented as protests, but it just speaks to the Austrian government, which is bizarrely, it's one thing that really boggles my mind, is why particular governments go really full full totalitarianism, you know. These are obviously people are protesting in the streets and stuff, but if you just go down towards the bottom, it just gives you a breakdown or a brief summary of what's going on in Austria. In November, the Austrian government signalled its intentions to make vaccine against COVID-19 mandatory, and Parliament is scheduled to vote on the issue this coming week. If mandatory vaccination plans are passed, and they probably will be, Austrians will face actually repeated fines of thousands of euros for remaining unvaccinated.
Yeah.
So that's what they're facing. I mean, you're talking here about the X number of few million Austrians who have not been vaccinated from February, sometime in February, being fined increasingly on an increasing scale of significant amount of money per individual for not being vaccinated. So it's one step away from being put in prison, right? I mean, because if you break the law, you can get fined. You don't go to prison.
Well, if you don't pay your fines,
then you might. Well, they've said that won't be non-payment won't transfer to a criminal prosecution, but that could change easily. They've said that was one of the kind of amendments, I think, and the next one is Greece, which is quietly in the background there being this has been on the books for quite a while. It's happening already. Greek Prime Minister has made a final appeal to the country's senior citizens to get inoculated before monthly punishments for violating the country's vaccination mandate kicking in next week, so this coming week. So this is for everybody who's over 60 and still unvaccinated. Will be fined €50 from Monday and €100 each month from February unless they get vaccinated. And this is despite the fact that 90% of those citizens over 60 have already been vaccinated. So this is targeted against 10% of the senior citizens in Greece are going to be punished with fines that a lot of them can't afford for not being vaccinated.
by effectively having their pension reduced.
Right. For not being vaccinated against something that poses no danger to them.
All proceeds will go to the country's health system. So
Yeah.
it's a kind of a regressive tax, which is interesting because while that sounds extreme, it's also being floated in other countries at the front end, where their governments are suggesting taxing the unvaccinated specific amounts, supposedly to make up for the fact they're an extra burden on the healthcare system.
Right.
So that's what's being touted in Australia, and I think it's being floated in North America as well.
Right. And of course, honourable mention to France, who has just, within the past couple of days, pretty much instituted a vaccine pass, has turned their health pass, modified it into being only vaccine pass, i.e. beforehand, if you could get a test of some description, somehow you could continue to engage in all social activities or all social life. But now, from today, basically, starting now, it's only if you're vaccinated. If you're not vaccinated, if you can't show a vaccine certificate of some description, you're not allowed into restaurants, bars, cinemas, blah, 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 blah.
And fully vaccinated, which means
Full.
three.
Yes.
Three shots.
Well, it depends on when you've been vaccinated. If your double dose was before June sometime, then you have to get the third one. If it's after June or July, you're okay with your double vaccination for a while, of course, but that'll run out, right? Within a couple of months, you have to get a booster. Again, it's about forcing people to get vaccinated and boosted, a third vaccination, forcing people to get 1, 2, or 3, or all of them, at a time when pretty much all recognized authorities are saying that this pandemic is over. Why would they be doing that?
Well, my first thought was just inertia. They've been on such a drive.
They don't want to back
Boosters,
down.
vaccines, now fines. Austria's on the leading edge of that, where they're mandating everyone, period, be vaccinated. To do anything, to be in Austria, to be breathing air. I mean, that's definitely the full edge of that. In Greece, it's more selective. In France, it's more selective too, because it doesn't apply to
Everyone's not being forced, yeah.
access to
Yeah,
buy food.
right. What about the UK? Bojo. Bit of a scandal, ongoing running scandal with floppy-headed Bojo and his friends all throughout the entire pandemic, really
Partygate.
displaying clear evidence that they did not take any of the rules seriously. The rules that they were passing on or imposing on the entire population, they didn't take them seriously. If you just throw up the Daily Mail article there, it's a good headline. A fridge too far. This is, of course, there's been revelations coming out, as days pass, and this is summation of them, was that Downing Street held wine time Fridays every single week throughout the pandemic. And now staff are being accused of taking a suitcase to Tesco Metro to fill up with booze and having a drinks fridge delivered in December 2020. So they were just living it up, probably snorting cocaine, all sorts of stuff, snogging each other, naked twister, the whole works, throughout the entire pandemic when so they'd come from a session of naked twister and coke and, Prosecco, and they'd clean themselves up and stand out in front of the cameras and tell everybody that they needed to stay at home and not see their grannies and not go to the funeral of your...
Yeah. In one particularly devastating one, they said there was a party at Downing Street the day before the Queen had to be on her own.
At her husband's funeral, yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm not sure. Obviously, let's state the obvious first. This is outrage in the UK, understandably, deservedly. But I don't trust. It's not not a matter of trust. The issue is, like, the British media and the British government just go from scandal to scandal.
And water off a duck's back.
Yeah, nothing happens. Nothing. I mean, what might happen here, seriously, is that Boris Johnson will resign. He's got the whole of Parliament on his back.
Except, what happened this week, whenever it came out, when the latest revelation about him being at a party the night before the Queen was forced to isolate on her own and couldn't have any family around her at her husband's funeral, he was at a party. And when that came out, the day after, he announced, or his spokesperson announced, that Boris one of his family members had tested positive, and that he was therefore, out of an abundance of caution, going to isolate himself for a week, and therefore he would not be in the public eye for a week. So in response to him being accused of exploiting the COVID fear and COVID hysteria, to impose penalties or impose restrictions on other people while he ignored them, in response to being outed as having done that, he doubles down and uses COVID to escape the limelight, escape the spotlight.
Yeah,
it's pretty. It doesn't get much more cynical than that,
Here's another cynical take, though. This will be used to bring in a government that does follow the rules, that does believe this is a deadly virus, because that's what you should be taking from this, that everyone in government who issued advice these last 2 years in the United Kingdom didn't believe it. They didn't believe this was the plague. They didn't even believe this was a particularly bad flu.
Right.
They carried on. In fact, they used the downtime to increase the fun.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They didn't believe it to that extent, to the extent of all the drinking parties that went on.
Yeah.
So my fear is that this is going to be used to get in a government who does believes hard. Not necessarily that there's a killer virus.
That would be scary.
But that this is like, we should lock people in.
On the basis of what?
Look at Israel.
Yeah.
That kind of scenario.
Well, there's something else. And we talked about quite a while ago now, obviously, at the beginning of this quote-unquote pandemic, about how governments around the world treated care home residents very badly. Elderly in care homes, they basically kicked them out of hospital where they were receiving treatment back into care homes and left them there with no primary health care and left them basically to die through neglect, effectively. And that was a major a major part of the specific numbers, or the spike in numbers, let's say, of deaths in the first couple of months. I mean, there was a British Medical Journal article that we referenced quite a few times at the time, showing that over the I think it was the month of May, just, or maybe it was over April and May, that there were 20,000 excess deaths over those 2 months, extra deaths in care homes in the UK that were not attributed to COVID. So that was something that was pretty galling and something, but nobody cared. Apparently, nobody did anything about it. It was government carelessness, basically. Government, that is an example, that evidence that government did not care about elderly people at all, despite the fact that that was the main refrain, right? Protect the elderly. Lock yourself in your house, don't see your families, don't see your parents, grandparents, because to protect the elderly, while the government was not protecting them at all, actually treated them like so much dead wood. The same is happening again as a result of vaccines. If you just throw up that first one I sent you there, Scotty. There's some Sky News. It's actually from November, but this is an ongoing thing. People in residential care dying alone and neglected amid dangerously low staffing levels. Now, dangerously low staffing levels is because of the way government policy towards care homes and the stress that people working in care homes have been under. But a big part of it is vaccination, where the vaccine mandates. There's a lot of people who work in care homes
Who quit.
who do not want to get the vaccine, and have not just quit and also been forced out. They're now being forced out because they're not vaccinated. There was depending on the country, there was a certain time frame in which you had to get vaccinated. If you weren't vaccinated by that point, you're fired.
Yeah.
And again, who suffers? Well, the residents of care homes, right? You just go to the next one after that. That was the UK. That one's the UK. The next one, this is in Calgary. Staffing shortage is key concern as Alberta's continuing care homes battle fifth wave. Again, staff shortages for the same reason. And then the third one is another one. You can find more of these. It basically seems to be a pattern across the Western world. Ohio's nursing homes are bracing for potential staff exodus as the courts uphold a vaccine mandate. So again, they're mandating vaccines on relatively young people who work in care homes looking after the elderly. They're forcing them to they're basically firing them, forcing them to leave their jobs because they won't get a vaccine against a virus that poses no threat to them. And the result is that they're significantly impacting the quality of life and, in many cases, death of elderly people in care homes. What does that say about government policy and the governments who are actually standing over this policy? If anybody would like to give me a positive spin on that, feel free, but I can't think of one. Anyway, that's the state of the world on... Well, let's go back to the start. There's a couple of videos. Just run through them quickly. The first two Twitter ones, Scotty. Two sides of the world, basically. Almost the antipode. This one is unvaccinated protesters arrested in New York City tonight. Well, they weren't actually unvaccinated protesters. They're unvaccinated diners who are dining inside an Olive Garden restaurant in New York City. And the cops came and... well, you could just play it there and you'll see a little bit.
Arresting us to try to eat. Wake up, New York! Wake up, New York!
Wake up? Yeah, sometimes.
Oh.
Keep going, yeah.
Shaman, tell me what happened.
Apparently, my civil rights 1964 Act has been unlawfully taken away from folks. Basically, you know what happened? I got arrested. They arrested me for trying to eat at Olive Garden. That's what happened. I'm not vaccinated.
What precinct?
The discrimination. My religious conception. So I am here now.
All right.
Getting arrested.
You can jump to the next one. There's just a stream of people they arrest coming out of there that they found without a vaccine certificate. So you're arrested. That's New York City. This is maybe the other side of the world, obviously. Australia. Summertime down there. Cops coming to try and close a bar that is open, bar/restaurant, and it's a bit more heartening.
With honour we serve.
Trespassing, please. I need you to listen to me. My name is Ray Bush. I'm an acting senior sergeant with Queensland Trespassing. I am not trespassing. I'm here to speak to the owner and the operator of the bar. He's not here. You people that are preventing me from entering the bar are obstructing police.
Abstracting police.
No, because I've got a sword.
Get them our way.
Well, please move aside. I've got a sword foot. You know what's in here? This is the common law. The people have spoken. This is also a political protest, which is civilly and constitutionally protected. So your badge, your uniform, is gone.
Don't push him! Don't assault him! With honour you serve! Prove it!
With honour, you serve!
With honour you serve! Act in honour!
I can't do it. It's a civil and it's a civil.
People in shirts, inside the shirt and stuff.
Don't you feel embarrassed doing this, mate? Seriously.
I wish you guys would come in and have a drink.
You're getting bacterial pneumonia wearing those masks, hypoxia, which is lack of oxygen, hypercarbia, hypercapnia, which is elevated CO2. You're giving yourself cancer. Your bosses don't care about you. You look like a fucking Smurf bred with an X-Man. Jesus. That's my personal opinion. Nice doesn't cut it. I don't think you're very nice standing here hassling a business owner trying to support his family. Okay? So we'll agree to disagree on what you think is nice. Nice. Not very nice what you guys are doing to this owner, mate. Where's the love? Where's the compassion? Where's the honour?
Catch some criminals!
Disgraceful, acting senior sergeant. Disgraceful, dishonourable, un-Australian.
An Australian. G'day. Well, yeah, I mean, it's good to see that some Australians are kind of like taking a bit of a stand, and especially you can see it's happening. The thing is, it's seasonal. This, you know what I mean? Australia is obviously, as everybody knows, Australia has gone full. I don't know, full convict colony. What?
We have an Australian question actually in the comments. It
Yeah.
says, why do governments go full retard?
Why do they go full retard?
Yeah.
Some of them compared to others,
Oh,
or all of them.
I think they're all going to be there someday.
Well, as we've said, yeah, if they're all going to be there someday, then if you paint them all with the same brush, as we've said repeatedly on the show, people need to understand, get out of their heads the idea that government is there to serve, or that government is
Which
there
is
to...
what one of those guys
Right, or that
shouted.
is trying to tell them, which obviously they're not doing. Government is not there to serve. That's just a sop, a way to manipulate people into accepting government or believing in government, let's say. Or that they're there to care for you. Most people have this, like we've said before, this kind of dysfunctional relationship with government where they see it as kind of like their mommy and daddy. There's an emotional relationship in that respect with a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people. And so they have to believe that mommy and daddy are caring, right? So it's automatic. It's a social contract. We give power to you and you do the right thing by us. But governments and are made up of people, and they're not there to serve. They're there to control. They very quickly understand, and have for a very long time, obviously, that their main job is to control people, not care about them. Now, control can be kind of compassionate control or caring control, possibly, depending on the person. But there's obviously a serious corruption problem in government. Has been there for a long time, where the ethos or the ideology amongst politicians is that they're there to serve themselves, to enrich themselves, to benefit themselves, first and foremost. And once they start down that path, they immediately very quickly start to have an antagonistic and not very close or positive or friendly attitude or relationship with the people anymore, because the more you engage in kind of mild to begin with, corruption and self-enrichment, the more you instinctively see that the people are a threat to you continuing to do that, or even or a threat to your job if that was ever to be exposed, to the little clique, the little operation you've got going there with you and all your other political friends, basically. So very quickly, the population become seen as the other and the one that's not just there to be controlled, but is also potentially a threat to me individually as a politician and to the entire political establishment. So people need to get out of their heads the idea that the government actually cares about them or is well disposed towards them. At this point in history, they're not well disposed. They see you as, at the very least, a potential threat to them, and therefore any opportunity that comes along that provides you options or the means to control the population, to lock them down, to squeeze them, to restrict their movement, to restrict their thinking, and to manipulate their thinking, then they're going to take it and they're going to run with it. They're going to be on board. Most of them are going to be on board. There's a few, obviously, who don't like to see that, don't like and understand that that's not what they personally got into politics for. But when they look around them, they see very few other people like that. They see the overwhelming majority of other politicians who are either willing to just keep their heads down and, carry on with the system, or others who are would be actively against them, trying to do right by the people or do their job properly or whatever. It's way beyond that point. And people have lots of evidence for that, you know what I mean? And they have for many years complained about it periodically. They see evidence of corruption in government and they say politicians are corrupt, blah, 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 blah. But in this situation, apparently, that doesn't apply anymore. For some bizarre reason, that knowledge and that awareness they have that government is generally corrupt from the top down, maybe most corrupt at the top, and then degrees of corruption as you come down the pyramid. They know that, they recognize that, they talk about it with their friends, with their families, they post about it in social media, they read about it in the media, in the mainstream media. But when it comes to coronavirus, apparently that's not, or the pandemic, that can't enter into it, that can't be part of it for some reason. The corruption aspect can't be part of it. Therefore, everything the government says, like a big section of the British population, for example, would say that everything the government has ever said, the government at the time, or whatever government was in position of power at the time of Brexit, that everything the government says about Brexit is false. A big section, maybe 30-40% of the British population would say that. But those same people can't say that about the pandemic.
Yeah.
Go figure.
Yeah.
Because maybe it gets back to what we said before, is that this is a lived experience for people. It's real. It's true. It was a real pandemic. There really were deaths. All those deaths were with COVID. Were from COVID, not with COVID, because we saw it. They experienced it vicariously, either directly through someone they might have known, or certainly vicariously for most people through the media. All the deaths, they locked themselves down. They couldn't see their families. We experienced it. It was a real experience for me. Therefore, it's real. Therefore, they're not inclined to believe anything that goes against that, even if it's on the BBC today.
Yeah,
they have a difficulty going against it, because the BBC today is effectively in publish. The BBC and other media and other authorities are effectively by mentioning that with and from COVID, they're undermining the lived experience of hundreds of millions of people. So you get to the point where they can say that, and the people won't believe it. Yeah. People have believed everything the media and authorities have said all along, a lot of it being lies. But now when the media turns around and tells the truth, the people turn around and won't believe the truth. So it's just so messed up. I don't know what to do about it. Bring on the comments or something. Bring on a volcano in the middle of somewhere, I don't know.
You want to talk about that?
Well, let's do that at the end.
Oh yeah.
First of all, I want to talk about tanks on European streets.
I saw that in Sweden.
What is that all about, man? Well, we know what it's about. Stick it up there, Scotty. RT. Tanks on European streets due to a Russian threat. Guess where this is? This is Sweden. So, explain it to us there, Neil.
So the Swedish government has moved tanks into position on its Baltic Sea island of Gotland. Gotland? Don't know how you pronounce that.
Scotland, yeah.
If you scroll down there, Scotty, it says it's in anticipation of a potential Russian ground war invasion through the Baltic Sea. A rapid response tactical unit of the Swedish Armed Forces has been deployed.
God help us.
The Swedish military said the effort should be seen, i.e., this is what we want you to believe, doesn't matter about the reality of it, should be seen as part of Sweden adapting its strategy to, quote, to the tense situation between Russia and Ukraine. Okay. Sweden's a long way from Ukraine, so obviously there's no real threat, but I don't know.
Well,
It's not just Sweden, though. I mean, everyone is being put on a war footing up and down the Russian border.
let's do this didactically. We need some graphics to succinctly explain what's going on here. So there's Russia on the right. There's Ukraine down below it on Russia border. Funny, who made this map? I've colored Ukraine and Belarus the same as Russia. Check that out. This must be like a Russophilic map maker. Because you'd almost think Ukraine and Belarus were part of Russia there, no? With that colouring.
Yeah.
Anyway, Russia's problem is that, you know, as we said in previous shows, US coup 2014 in Ukraine, took over Ukraine, militarized it, nationalized it, imposed, you know, put in place very anti-Russian nationalistic government, have been training the Ukrainian army, building it up to threaten Russia, basically, because Russia doesn't like any enemy, basically, on its borders. Always wanted a buffer zone, and Ukraine is no longer a buffer zone for Russia. But of course, and if you've got Belarus there, and you've got the kind of Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania. But look at where Sweden, Sweden. So we're talking about Sweden in this article. Sweden putting tanks in the streets, and Gotland. It's a little island off the coast of Scotland there, basically. We can read it, but I just want to show that map and show you. Keep in mind Sweden and Finland. Finland. My point here in showing this map is that Finland is on Russia's border, and in terms of Ukraine, Russia's problem is no further expansion eastwards of NATO.
Yeah.
And the US taking over Ukraine basically is a tantamount to an expansion of NATO, or potentially an expansion of NATO. Even if Ukraine doesn't join NATO, it could be more or less like part of NATO in the sense of, you know, stationing US missiles, etc., right on Russia's border. So that's a big no-no. It's the same for America. It didn't want any foreign missiles in Cuba or anywhere close to American borders. So they would have the same response. So it's totally understandable that Russia has this as a red line, but apparently the Americans don't really care, and they're willing to antagonize and poke and torment the Russian bear for some. Well, we've talked about that previously on other shows as well. But just keep in mind, there's Finland and Sweden, which are not NATO members as of now, but could be at any moment, right? In which case, Finland would be, well, like, in pretty much exactly the same situation as Ukraine, right? It would be responded to in exactly the same way.
The Finnish
by Russia.
government signaled it might do so.
Right, as a threat, and also Sweden. So just go back to the article. So you have armoured vehicles pictured rolling through the streets of a Swedish town as military said tensions between Russia. So suddenly there's tensions between Russia and Ukraine, and suddenly there's tensions now between Russia and Sweden for some bizarre reason. So they've ramped up the security on the largest Baltic Sea island of Gotland with a view to adapting its security strategy to the tense situation on the Russia-Ukrainian border. So, rapid response tactical unit of the Swedish Armed Forces deployed to the island, the military said in a statement. A A part of the unit was flown in on Friday evening by the US C-17 heavy transport aircraft. Anyway, the Swedish military said that the effort should be seen as part of Sweden adapting its strategy to the tense situation between Russia and Ukraine. Moscow dismissed the statements about Russia planning to invade Ukraine as fake news. Anyway, the deployment does not have to mean an increased threat, the Swedish Armed Forces Chief of Operations said. But they've also said that they saw increased Russian activity in the Baltic Sea, which deviates from the normal picture. This island is presented as Sweden's most vulnerable place. Now get this, 2 paragraphs down. Well, actually, 1 paragraph. German tabloid Bild went even further, specifically linking the surprise Swedish deployment to Russia's recent decision to move 3 of its heavy landing ships from the Barents Sea and the Arctic Ocean to the Baltic Sea. Citing an anonymous Stockholm official, it's always best to be anonymous in these things when you're talking shit. The paper said the Swedish army has been on alert in case Russian President Vladimir Putin decides to use the ships to capture Gotland. Should Putin plan anything against the Baltic countries, he would first have to take Gotland. We see the Russian troop movements and we have to take this scenario seriously. According to the source, Moscow might be tempted to deploy its S-14 air defense systems to the island of Gotland to cut off the Baltic states from NATO air support. The paper has provided no evidence that a plan to invade and occupy part of Sweden has ever been considered by Russia, but it's all good, right? It's grist for the mill. So yeah, on the very bottom, there, the point that, you know, how this ties in, obviously, is on Saturday, former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen said in an interview with a Finnish outlet that a Russian attack would provoke a discussion in Finland and Sweden regarding future NATO membership. So this is, it gets you into what's going on behind the scenes with these talks, and the way that the talks between the US and Russia are going nowhere, nothing comes out of them, but what's actually being planned by both sides, independent of any talking with each other, how they're very suspicious of each other and how they're making contingency plans behind the scenes, right? So obviously one part of it would be one of the threats that they would, or that they're leveling against Russia if they do anything in Ukraine, is that if you go near Ukraine, if you invade Ukraine, as we keep claiming you're going to, Sweden and Finland would immediately become part of NATO, and of course then Russia has double trouble, right? It's so obsessed with Ukraine not being part of NATO, but if it does anything about that, you're going to have Ukraine plus Finland, the other, sizable country, the really only other sizable country on your border as a part of NATO. So you can see how that's really, they're tormenting the Russians in that respect. They're really turning the screws on them, and that they're not happy about it, obviously.
Yeah. But it also shows that de facto, the US military can already reach into a non-NATO member and stage a stunt like this to hold the threat against Russia. I mean,
they may as well be part of NATO.
They may as well be part of NATO. The US can move anywhere. The point is the US wants access to every corner of the earth. It doesn't believe anywhere should block it off.
Right.
The same applies to China. You don't get to decide where we go, what we see, what we do. That's the issue. And they will go into any country. They can do already. That they can do that in Sweden. And non-NATO members, it speaks volumes.
Yeah. It speaks volumes about how furious the US is that Russia, and they have been furious for a very long time against Russia, as people should know by now, due to all of the black ops and the black propaganda that's been used against Russia over the past 7, 8, 9, 10 years. The Americans have been extremely angry at Russia for simply defying American hegemony or American hegemonic intentions in the world, pushing back against them and thwarting them in different places. They've been incensed by that, and you don't see it coming out. I mean, they don't. There are no spittle-flecked rants from the U.S. State Department against Russia, but you can infer just how pissed off they are by the way that what they've been doing, basically. just go to the next one there, Scotty. It's just it's your favorite person, Neil.
Well, that is pretty close to a spittle fact rant.
Her?
Newland.
That's as close as it gets, except there's no spittle,
yeah.
right?
The US
Sharp
yeah.
pain. So they've got 18 different scenarios. Apparently, if you scroll down to the third paragraph. I'm not going to preview 18 different scenarios, Newland said. I would simply say that our commitment and the conversation that we have with our allies is around inflicting very sharp pain very fast if Russia moves one finger to touch my Ukraine and fuck the EU.
That's, of course, what she's infamous for. I don't know what to say. COVID leaves you speechless. Sort of shit leaves me speechless. This is the woman who said, fuck the EU.
Yeah.
Right? So that is the attitude that the Americans have as they go into any country they want, anywhere on the goddamn European continent, and do whatever the fuck they want.
Yeah.
All day, every day, all the time. And she can say whatever she wants. Who's in charge? Not the national governments. The European Union isn't. And it's all inexorably leading to, well, I was going to say World War III, but it is and it isn't, because I suppose, on the one hand, thank God, because Russia will never actually fall for the bait. On the other hand, damn it, I wish they would, to try and end this interminable fucking standoff where there's the illusion of democracy and sovereign nations. And the US says that in its response to Russia's request to answer eight specific questions it had about what the US was doing in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. Mm-hmm. They actually said, specifically said, one of Russia's 8 points was, Ukraine is not to join NATO. Please let us both agree on that. The United States official response this week during the high-level talks with the Russian government was, no, Ukraine is a sovereign government. Ukraine democratically gets to decide what it wants to do with its own. And you have that, when you have that attitude coming from people who basically run that government.
Yeah.
Well, what can you do? You just hope for it to be.
Yeah.
I don't know.
They want you to use the fish, Neil.
Yeah. And I mean, Russia has, you just said it basically, and it's standard operating procedure for the CIA and the State Department in Ukraine. Just throw up the Yahoo News article there just as evidence for it. We can just do the first, we can just do the headline really. Don't know, but yeah. CIA trained Ukrainian paramilitaries may take central role if Russia invades. CIA is overseeing a secret intensive training program in the US for elite Ukrainian special operations forces and other intelligence personnel, according to five former blah, blah, blah.
They leaked this. They don't mind this being known now. They've been doing that for a long time. Especially Obama launched this program. He gave the okay for the US military to recruit Ukrainians who were then trained in bases in the United States in the same model as the stay-behind units back during the First Cold War. Ostensibly, the idea is if Russia invades Ukraine, of course, they have insurgency units ready to go.
Or dare I say, if you just throw up that next one, the same model as this. Dramatic pause.
Yeah.
They certainly have no lack of experience of training terrorists, which is what they've effectively been doing in Ukraine.
Yeah. It's the same. It's here. It's about ISIS being trained by, or Al Qaeda anyway, by Western forces. The CIA specifically. That operation is well known. It's covered the Operation Timber Sycamore. Obama approved to train jihadis, moderates, so-called. It's the same with Ukraine. There's nothing moderate about these people.
The
There's
liver
nothing
eaters.
democratic about these people. They're nuts.
You remember the liver eater that they were training?
The who?
The liver eater. I think it was an Nusra guy in Syria.
Yeah.
Was filmed himself eating some guy who killed his liver, cutting his organs out and eating. That was one of the CIA linked adepts basically in Syria. So that's the kind of people. But there's also, I mean, we shouldn't. I mean, we talk about this, you know, Russia, US, Ukraine. There's obviously financial motives in all of this as well. We've talked about it previously I mentioned last week, I think, about the US wanting to, terrified of losing Europe to Russia, and which is why Nord Stream is central in this in terms of Russian gas supply, which is significant to Europe, and that increasing European dependency on Russia, and America being terrified of that because ultimately they see that they might lose Russia politically or diplomatically or whatever to and therefore and ultimately economically to the east, let's say, to Russia and to further east. But if you just go to the next the next article points that out. The US seeking ways to profit should Russia-Ukraine conflict break out, because obviously there's a major profit here. They really want Russia to do something in Ukraine that justifies them sanctioning, putting these swift, immediate, sharp, painful sanctions, i.e., among which would be completely mothballing or cancelling Nord Stream 2, which means that suddenly Europe is much more reliant on American LNG, liquefied natural gas. So this was Ted Cruz, the guy, you know, all the anti-leftists love to love because he's such a swell guy. He tried to he introduced a bill to impose sanctions without Russia doing anything, immediate sanctions on Nord Stream 2, because he comes from Texas and there's a lot of LNG producers in Texas, and it would be a boon for them if Nord Stream 2 gets nixed. So there's a lot of financial motivation behind all of this as well. You know, it's very cynical in that respect, you know.
Yeah.
The other thing, if you just go to the next one, just skipping through these pretty quickly, that I've been, you know, interested, I suppose, to note is previous to this, Russia had claimed that the US was planning a provocation in Ukraine with chemical weapons.
Yeah.
In the same way they had done in Syria on several occasions.
And there's some evidence for that.
There is some evidence for it. And in response to that, the US claimed that that Russia was planning a false flag
attack
to justify. So they're both accusing each other of wanting the other to start something in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to start something in Ukraine? I don't know. I mean, probably the US does, like as we've just said. But what I find interesting about this is that, and this is just from RT, but it's like it's been across all the mainstream media, the same allegations. But they use that term "false flag" as if it's everybody knows false flags. They happen all the time, right? What do you mean by false flags? Are you saying like is that the same as 9/11 was an inside job type thing? The one that crazy tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists claims, and now the mainstream media are just using it nonchalantly in their headlines. False flags are just run of the mill. Yeah, happens all the time.
Or is it the same as this? Scotty, put this one up. This came out this week. Now and then, you know, it gets out as to who does what. Headline in the Scottish National: Secret Service behind Barcelona terror attacks, says ex-cop. So this was a senior Spanish police commander, now retired. For some reason, he's up in court for something. But he's come out and said that the Spanish government, or security services specifically, coordinated, facilitated, conducted, whatever. He said they did it, period. The 2017 terror attacks that took place in Barcelona and a nearby town the day after.
Remember, that was a guy in a car or truck or something down the Ramblas.
Killed 13 people.
Ran over.
And then a day later in a seaside town, a bunch of guys, jihadis, came out of a truck and started shooting people.
Right.
And Johnny on the spot 30 seconds later were special forces to gun them all down. Shoot them dead.
Dead men tell no tales. So yeah, this guy has, and interestingly, if down the bottom of that, this guy Villarejo is something of an off-the-reservation figure and has been involved with numerous secret operations with the CNI, that's the Spanish intelligence. His claims triggered anger in Catalonia. First of all, he says, all the evidence is in my archives and I authorize their release. His claims triggered anger in Catalonia, where the government was considering a legal response. Catalan President Pérez Aragonés said on social media, the 17th of August, which was the attack, was a barbarity that has marked us forever, and if Villarejo's words are true, explanations are needed now. He says, we know very well how the state sewers work, so we demand that they be investigated in order to clarify the truth. That's the president of Catalonia. I have also asked the legal services of the government to study these statements and the relevant legal actions that can be taken for the truth, for the victims, for the Catalans, and for all those who are on the side of peace and democracy.
So if you remember back at the time...
just to finish that one, he also expressed concern that no one from the state, from the Spanish government, had so far contradicted his statements or said they would be investigated. So we didn't get any pushback.
Yeah. Yeah. Remember, this was just before the referendum in Catalonia.
Right.
So this guy says the actual motivation for carrying it out was to remind the Catalonians why they need us,
why they need central
why
government.
you need Madrid, Spain. You're not leaving this country or terror. Of course, it wasn't sold to them like that at the time. It was sold to them like, oh, well, look at that. Jihadis just picked this time to go nuts on Catalonians.
Yeah.
Well, we'll step in here and help protect you. We'll shoot them dead after we've released them.
Mm-hmm.
That scenario, right? At the same time, that was part of the angle. It was a schizoidal time because the West was trying to handle the beast that had created, ISIS, which had been running terror attacks all over Europe, not just there, of course, for several years. But then Russia comes in Syria and goes, oh, you have a terrorist problem in Europe. Watch this. Puts the fire out. And then the terror attacks just stop. And it didn't stop so much because there was no longer material ability and capacity to carry it out. I'm pretty sure it stopped because the rationale for having the terror attacks, which was to elicit political currency in Europe by US or / Western intelligence agency, was no longer there because Putin would have gotten all the kudos for defeating the enemy, you see? And so, okay, we can't use it anymore. Nevertheless, at the time, it was schizoidal because they were using both excuses. They were saying, well, this is ISIS. They just randomly sprung up in the middle of this contentious political issue between Barcelona and Madrid. And by the way, the Russian government is coordinating this breakaway referendum. They're providing the servers. They're in a league with Julian Assange, Russian government, Russian interference in our democracy, Russian blah, 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 on and on. So they use both.
Yeah.
Well, it's the same hand that's actually the one that accuses Russia is the same hand that does these kinds of things.
Yeah. When you tell a lot of lies, when the lies become so prevalent, you end up with completely contradictory statements from official sources that make no sense whatsoever. And that's a good indicator that there's massive, large-scale lies being told. And basically, most people's understanding or perception of a reality is completely false. In terms of how the world works and what's actually happening in the world, that's definitely an indication of it, you know. But there was, I think, was it this week that was he talking about false flags?
Cyber attacks.
Cyber attack. Just throw up that one. Again, capitalizing on it. So the Ukrainian government and various different government websites all had a cyber attack or were subject to a cyber attack about a week ago. So in response, NATO jumped in and said, okay, so Ukraine isn't going to become a NATO member, but it's going to become a NATO cyber member in a certain sense, because NATO, and in response to these attacks, has struck signed a cyber security deal with Kiev within days of that cyber attack. Now it's just come out supposedly today that it was Belarus. That it was someone
Ukraine
in Belarus.
doesn't formally accuse Russia, it accuses Belarus.
Right.
Yeah.
But then everybody knows Belarus is owned by Russia, so it's
Russia.
the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So whatever.
Did you see what the message said? Supposedly you go to every homepage of every Ukrainian.gov website and the message read, here's the actual message, Ukrainian, ! All your personal data has been uploaded to the public network. Stop. All data on the computer is destroyed. Stop. It is impossible to restore them. Stop.
All
Be
your,
afraid and wait for the worst. Stop.
all your bases are ours.
This is for you, for your past, present, and future. For Volnia, I think that's Western Ukraine. For the OUN UIA, which is the CIA-backed Ukrainian terrorists going back to the 1940s, basically Nazis. For Galicia, Western Ukraine. For Policy, I think that's a part of Ukraine, that's now Poland. And for all historical lands.
Yeah.
That was the actual message. That it's meant, on the surface, you're meant to read that as a Westerner and go, gosh, those poor Ukrainians, that's horrible. What they imagine them having all. That's really. Who would say something like that to Ukrainians? Really trying to push all their buttons like that. So, obviously, then it's only a Russian who could say such things to really hurt poor Ukrainians.
It sounds
But
like
as if any Ukrainians is actually scared.
it
by
sounds like a Slavic version of a caliphate. You know what I mean? They're advocating for a Slavic caliphate. You know, it's like a white Western ISIS.
Well, they have a bill lined up in Congress in the United States, should Russia do anything wrong, to hold Russia as something like the chief sponsor of terrorism on the earth, and for all its
Right.
government, i.e. the president on down,
Yeah.
to be sponsors of terrorism.
Forever.
So they're...
They're going full retard, yeah.
We thought in 2015 when Putin did Syria, he just killed the whole terrorism angle. But 7 years later, you can see how they would like to actually, they still think they can turn the ship around and just, okay, forget the caliphate. It's, the Moscow Duchy.
Yeah. The
the-
Moscow Caliphate. Putin's like he's like the head of ISIS who wants to establish a Russian caliphate over all of Europe. You know, he's going to claim that all European peoples are actually Russian and they all need to be taken back home into the arms of Mother Russia. But so yeah, the cyber attack is interesting because around the same time, actually, if you just throw up the Bloomberg article there, Scotty. The EU announced that it is going to stage large-scale cyber attack exercise on supply chains, no less. So the simulation is starting this week, which was like this past week, and it's continuing on for 6 weeks, which gives us a good time frame. So over the next 6 weeks, we can keep an eye on, keep an eye on news about cyber attacks that affect the supply chains, which obviously that's what would be the problem. That's what would cause a problem with supply chains, right? There's no problem with the supply chains right now, due to 2 years of feckless government policies around the pandemic, but rather it's to do with, if anything happens, it'll be because there's a cyber attack. And now that we know that Russia/Belarus carried out a cyber attack on Ukraine, any cyber attack that has an effect on global or European supply chain mechanisms will definitely be Russia that did it. Right, we know that in advance now. And if it happens during this exercise, well, all the better, right?
Yeah. We've spoken in the past before about how, when it comes down to it, Moscow and Washington have yet to engage in any kind of a frontal hot war with each other since 1945, because it'll lead to mad mutually assured destruction. So there's kind of a natural, so to speak, injunction against it. And then we've spoken also about there nevertheless being some leeway for them to act on the global stage within those parameters. So Putin can counter in Syria, piss off the empire to no end, and they can't really frontally attack it back, except through information stunts, actual bloody stunts, perhaps the downing of an aircraft or two, that kind of thing, either blamed on Russia or simply done to Russia to make them think twice about continuing to expand their economic influence and their partnership with China in the East. So the cyber angle, this has been mentioned before Russia was bought into it, because isn't there a whole great reset stick where they're like, you know, the coming cyber pandemic or something.
For sure,
it's
yeah.
it's in Klaus Schwab's book and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
And
it's up there with
it's
with an actual you've
an
got
actual
viral pandemic, and
They've-
you've got a cyber pandemic in a way.
And it's framed, and it's going to be a natural consequence. Somebody's going to push a button wrong somewhere that will collapse the internet. Thus, the Internet of Things.
No, not push a button wrong. Some malign actor will actually try and take
Right.
it down through some deliberate action. Of
Right.
course, it'll be blamed on Russia, and it'll be the group that did it will be called Fancy Bear. They'll probably call themselves Fancy Russian Bear,
Yeah,
just to be clear. You know,
just
in case anybody's
Damascus
any doubts.
origin.
Yeah.
No, but what I was going to say was, this is also fair game. If only because they will never actually engage. I think more likely is that the key to that European Union cyber attack drill lies in having a Cold War rationale for why shit's gone foobar. Because the supply chain thing is to account for the fact on the ground that supply chains are disrupted
Right.
from the lockdowns,
Right.
from crop shortages,
Right.
from food
From weather.
shortages, from weather events. So it's
Volcanoes.
it's not just that there won't actually be a war. Even the apparent engagement of it is all shadowboxing. Even if Russia does not engage properly, come on, Russia, play your role.
They don't have
At
to.
least spar with us, pretend to.
Yeah, they don't
Russia's
have to.
just standing there going, what are you doing?
Yeah.
They don't have to, because America and the board as a whole can fight in a fantasy fight that tacks on to real world things that are going on and plausibly explains them. And you know, you can go all the way with it. And this was very successfully put by the astronomer, British astronomer Victor Klube, back in the 1980s, when he realized, holy schmuck, the actual threat potential from cosmic objects, asteroids, comets to this planet, while not imminent, he wasn't, you know, a doomsayer. He said, realistically, it is within human timescales for us to face a civilization-ending event. It is an ongoing threat on a longer scale. And that when it comes down to it, that's the only real threat. The only real climate change, environmental threat, the only real threat pandemic-wise, because it's, of course, associated with the Black Death and plague events, real pandemics, and so on. So governments, what are they going to do with that? Well, he says what they're going to do is they're going to have a Cold War instead of a cosmic war, which they can win. They don't know how to fight. Where are these objects? When are these objects coming? They don't know. We cannot fight that. What we can do is keep everyone engaged in the here and now, in the what's going on, keep them distracted, basically, so that we'll never have to actually tell them the reality of what life on this planet is like. And they will never, of course, rise up and throw us out,
Right.
which has happened within human timescales. And we're pretty sure that cometry, spaceborne factors were a key part in that. Certainly at the collapse of Rome, which, you know, isn't that long ago.
Yeah, it's interesting that they use that quote by Klube, and also that it was true. You know, that the US used the threat of the commies to expand their control and domination around the world, and then they didn't miss a beat, and they continued on with it after the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia was obviously the obvious choice to continue. Or to continue to play the role, to be used in the role as a kind of like an enemy, in order to cover up what the US and what the West was doing, but now not for reasons of necessarily global domination, but rather more specifically in terms of managing populations and preparing for climate disaster of some description.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, there's a big old kaboom down in the South Pacific.
Yeah.
Yesterday.
Yeah.
Just give us a wee look out there, Scott. There's a couple of videos that are pretty awesome. People have probably seen them ad nauseum already, but Hunga Wunga Bunga Munga volcano kaboom. That's awesome. That's about 300 kilometers diameter,
Yeah.
roughly.
And you notice that,
About 200 miles.
I don't know what time scale that is, but the winds had no impact on it forming a mushroom cloud. That's how much force it had. And there are more than one. There are multiple shock waves that come out.
Yeah.
One main one, I suppose. They're the white.
If that had happened anywhere close to any landmass, populated landmass, it's kind of like that's a major disaster,
Yeah.
and people need to wake up because something like that is very possible in the not too distant future, and that'll be all short. And in fact, this itself, the amount of debris and dust ejected into the atmosphere is going to have an effect.
I've
it's
seen a
adding to,
lot
but
of-
it's going to have an effect.
It's early days, but I've seen debates between volcanologists and geologists on Twitter, and there's a school of thought there that's like, has anyone calculated the VEI on this, which is the volcanic explosive index? Because above a certain point, you're getting into climate changing, like, I mean, within a year,
Right.
climate changing type stuff.
Right.
The one that caused the year without summer, which was really 2 years without summer, around 1810, 12, you know, Napoleonic
Right.
Wars that came to an
volcano,
end
yeah.
as a result of that. That one was a VEI 6, and some volcanologists are like, this looks like a 5. We don't know because this is the first time we've had such space visuals
Right.
on it, and the blast wave doesn't really fit anything we're
They don't have-
familiar with.
they
They've
don't
never
have-
seen it in real time.
They don't have the ability to model it because they haven't had experience of modeling that kind of stuff. They have
What-
the ability
what they-
to
what-
model it, but they haven't modeled it.
What they
before.
usually do is they calculate the amount of ejecta, the
Right.
volume of ejecta, to
Right.
give you an idea of the blast. But
Right.
it may not be that simple. Even if this actually produced less volume of material in its explosion, it's the shape. It's the shape of the fact that it could maintain cohesion as a shape against dominant trade winds and a cyclone. There was a cyclone, tropical cyclone Cody was just 200 miles to the south of that. It had no impact on it forming that mushroom cloud shape.
Yeah.
It did eventually dissipate. I don't know how long after. Was it hours or just 1 hour? I'm not sure. But between the structure of a mushroom cloud it maintained and that blast wave you see rapidly going out, there are some experts that are saying that could be like up there with a VEI 5 or possibly 6,
Yeah.
which is the kind of thing
That
that
ca-
caused years without summer
Yeah, within a period
a
of
couple of
months,
hundred
yeah.
years ago.
Within a few months, once it gets around, goes around the globe, yeah. And if there's more, if similar events happen or other volcanoes go off and stuff, and of course there have been volcanoes going off repeatedly over the past number of years and stuff that are pumping all that kind of dust up into the
The
atmosphere.
one in La
and stuff,
Palma, of
yeah.
course.
So it's not looking good, and it's got nothing to do with people driving gasoline cars or burning coal or China burning coal.
I should point out as well that if you've seen videos that are supposedly filmed from a boat watching this just
Yeah, that
across
was
the water,
That was a previous
that
one.
was a previous eruption.
Yeah.
That wasn't. If you were in that boat now, you were gone.
Yeah, yeah. Nobody was around this one, yeah.
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 What-
Tambora eruption 1815, correct, Aeneas. Was also the year of the Battle of Waterloo. Yeah, people have known. That's a really important part of history, really an interesting part of history to look into of, you know, basic volcanoes and other climate events linked to outbreaks of plague, but also famine and then ensuing wars throughout history. It seems that those kind of climate events, by which I mean
Yeah.
volcanoes, earthquakes, that kind of thing, are directly related to major events
Geopolitical
in
upheaval.
human history.
Yeah.
But they're usually airbrushed out of it. They're never reported in the actual history. You'll hear about different wars and different battles, but you won't hear about the actual geological event that happened right around the same time. you know.
Yeah. And which was it that drove the other?
Yeah, well, I'd say it was most likely. I mean, in the case,
Are
in the case
elites
of
today aware
yeah,
broadly, and they're like causing a distraction along the lines of what I suggested earlier
Right.
from Victor Klub?
yeah,
Or are they not aware, but so to speak, but there's some unconscious thing driving them to like, get it all
Yeah,
now,
lock
lock
it all
everyone
down.
down,
Yeah.
control them all now, quickly,
yeah, for sure.
before kaboom.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to wait and see. And that's exactly what we'll do. But we'll be keeping up with events as they transpire on a weekly basis, at least, as we have been doing. Have you got anything else before we hit the road? Because it's been almost 2 hours, so I'm all talked out. That's all the news that's fit to talk about. Basically, I'm sure there's other stuff, but, you know, we'll get to it. Yeah, so thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for listening or whatever you're doing. Don't forget to smash all the buttons. We hope you enjoyed the show. Thanks for commenting. Thanks for our commenters. It's always good to have you there to keep us on the straight and narrow. And we'll be back next week with another show on, well, you know what the topics will be. You'll see them as they transpire. And we'll try and maybe dig up some extra interesting bits of information. Maybe we should do more historical stuff like that, just little tidbits that we can kind of link into it, you know, just as a broad spectrum thing. So yeah, we'll stay on it, and you do too, and we'll be back next week with another show. So until then, have a good evening and stay safe, and don't fear the Omicron.
See you next week. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Hopefully we won't get banned. Bye.
Can't stop the signal now.